I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. I'm talking again about Israel and Hamas on profiteering and propaganda. As I've said before, by the time that I publish an article, it's only half done. The other half happens in the comment threads because I get so many well-informed references and much more knowledge every time. So in this case, I'm going to follow up on 4 of those references that I was sent. The first 2 were referred by Anders through our mutual friend Ernest, who posts on YouTube as the Electric Mule. And the first of those is by someone called Middle Nation. I am not familiar with him, but his is an excellent review called The Global South is Pro-Palestinian. The second is an article in Counterpunch from David Rovics, and I have known David Rovics and admired him for over a decade. I used to write about him in my radio show when I had one, and I've even met him. So that's really interesting, called The Gaza Ghetto Uprising. Then a video by Russell Brand on war profiteering by U.S. members of Congress. That was linked by Matthew Lemire on News Detective. And I'll end with 2 on Max Blumenthal. One was recommended by Fritz Freud, and that is a gray zone article where he looks at the source for the beheading babies bunk. The other was recommended by Yulia, and that is a Tim Pool interview and his crew of Max, in which he looks at all of this, including the beheading babies. Let's jump in. I don't know who the gentleman is who's speaking in Middle Nation, but he's very articulate and has a perspective that is not well known. So I highly recommend it. It's a short video, and I'll have all of these linked on my Substack. So here's a quote from it. "The only way that you can make the Israelis look good is by creating this cartoonish, fiendish image of Hamas. The Hamas incursion happened either because the so-called hardline Netanyahu government was either incompetent or because they betrayed their own people and let it happen. So it was either incompetence or treachery. Those are the only 2 options. You can't do anything today that more instantly identifies you as an unthinking, hypocritical sellout than changing your profile picture to the Israeli flag. I mean, if you do that, then I already know that you were one of those people who was probably wearing a COVID face mask during a Zoom call back in 2020 because you're an automaton. You think whatever power tells you to think, and you have no internal value system of your own. And like I said, this approach is not going to enable you to dominate the transition to the global south. It's going to completely discredit you and ruin any chance you have of influencing how the new global economic order is shaping and how it develops. The Arab world is with the Palestinians. Africa is with the Palestinians. Latin America is with the Palestinians. Asia is with the Palestinians. And obviously, 2 billion Muslims in the world, that's a 2 billion strong market, is with the Palestinians. And truth be told, your own public is mostly with the Palestinians. So if you decide to fight the inevitable, then you have decided from the outset to fall. The corporate factions, the business factions, the factions of the owners and controllers of global financialized capital who will actually prosper in the coming decades will be those factions who reflect and who do not conflict with the opinions and the attitude of the global South, and that means being pro-Palestinian. David Rovics' Counterpunch article, The Gaza Ghetto Uprising, I think is especially good for people who may not be as deep into the details of this as I think many of my readers are. But it starts in a very clever way by talking about an uprising and all of the homemade implements and brilliant strategy that went into being able to do this against oppressors who were surrounding them and who were fighting them on all sides. And only at the very end of that does he reveal that he's talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 by the Jewish Fighting Organization. So that did not end well, so we will hope that the parallel does not continue. And then Russell Brand. With all the attention that I've been paying to the sextroversy, I've forgotten why I simply love him. And this video brought it all back. So I recommend that if you are a detractor because all you're hearing about is Russell Brand from 15 years ago and you can't imagine why anyone would be listening to him now, watch this, because there's a reason. There's a reason that some of us have been paying attention to him. So rather than focusing on the conflict itself, he goes upstream to the war profiteering by members of U.S. Congress. The contrast between the cold-blooded investments of politicians in defense contractors versus their high moral ground public rhetoric about principles couldn't be more stark. One of the ideological bonds that I've had with Russell has been that he pays attention to systems, and that's how I approach problems also. So instead of jumping into the maelstrom of Israel and Hamas, he looks at where we should all agree. No one making decisions about whether to go to war should be profiting from it. He writes, "You wouldn't imagine that there will be anyone anywhere in the world looking to exploit such a sensitive and awful situation from which nobody really clearly benefits, if you ask me, to be looking for opportunities to profit. And yet that is precisely what's happening. Military experts are predicting record profits for weapons manufacturers, as always happens in war. That's a brutal reality, I suppose. But you certainly wouldn't expect members of the United States Congress to be investing in defense-related stocks. Wouldn't that undermine everything they've been telling you about the authenticity of their feelings, however they regard this conflict or claim to regard this conflict? All of the grandstanding and moralizing and the sympathetic "I stand with" or "we must be pro." How does that look in light of the fact that members of Congress have been investing in military-related stocks? Let's have a look at Joe Biden, pledging support and claiming that this is a simple moral issue. My administration and support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering. Let me say this as clearly as I can. This is not a moment for any party hostile to Israel to exploit these attacks to seek advantage. Russell adds that perhaps you could argue that it's not the moment for anyone to exploit these attacks to seek advantage. This corresponds to my statement in the last episode that any statement of ethics should never have proper nouns. And he adds, particularly not by people who are making decisions with regard to the military aspect of this encounter. He asks, if health crises are beneficial to pharmaceutical companies, if energy crises are beneficial to energy companies, all the while punitive to ordinary people all around the world, isn't that an opportunity for systemic analysis, revolution, reformation, and change? And last, here's Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone in an excellent article called "Source of Dubious Beheaded Babies Claim is Israeli Settler Leader Who Incited Riots to Wipe Out Palestinian Village." He writes, The gray zone has now identified a key source of the claim that Palestinian militants beheaded Israeli babies. He is David Ben Zion, a deputy commander of Unit 71 of the Israeli Army, who also happens to be an extremist settler leader who incited violent riots against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank earlier this year. In an October 10th interview with reporter Nicole Zadek of the Israeli state-sponsored I-24 network, Ben Zion stated, "We walked door to door. We killed a lot of terrorists. They are very bad. They cut heads of children. They cut heads of women. But we are stronger than them." He added, "We know that they are animals," referring to Palestinians, "but we found that they don't have any heart." So who is David Ben Zion? Max writes, David Ben Zion is the leader of the Shamron Regional Council of 35 illegal West Bank settlements, who called this year for the Palestinian village of Huwara to be wiped out. "Enough talk about building and strengthening the settlements," Ben David said in a Twitter post on February 26th. "The deterrence that was lost must return now. There's no room for mercy." Ben David was quoted in Israeli media proclaiming soon after, "The village of Haware should be wiped out. This place is a nest of terror, and the punishment should be for everyone." A clear call for the collective punishment of Palestinians. The village of Huwara was at that time the target of violent rioting by settlers, operating under Ben David's watch. Following the settler assault on the town, which resulted in the torching of scores of homes and vehicles, as well as injuries to locals, Hamas characterized the attack as a declaration of war. But Ben David's call for collective punishment in Huwara was far from his only genocidal imprecation against Palestinians. Indeed, he has used his social media accounts to repeatedly call for war crimes as well as the deportation of the Palestinian masses. "The Palestinian people are an enemy," Ben David wrote in 2016. "We can't change their barbaric DNA." During his failed campaign for the Israeli Knesset in 2021 with the pro-settler Jewish Home Party, Ben David described his mission as follows: "I am committed to the task of restoring the political home of religious Zionism." And Yulia referred me to this panel interview of Max Blumenthal by Tim Pool and 3 other idiots, young people. However, I recently found out that over half of my YouTube audience is over 65 and 65% of them are men. So I'm sure that Tim Pool would probably have some choice words for my demographic. But the kids are not entirely wrong. I've just been spoiled because I have a readership that is so articulate and well-informed and is always educating me and is so knowledgeable about these kinds of events. So they're not throwing things out like, "I think Palestine should become the 51st U.S. state. We'll straighten them out." Although this is 2 hours long, the second half is the boys arguing among themselves and, in my opinion, can be skipped. But Tim suggests that Israel should have cut off food to keep the Palestinians from procreating, and Max points out that this has already happened, and Max does a masterful job of explaining Israel's demographic problem and why they can't allow Palestinians to be in Israel without losing their majority. He also mentions the Abraham Accords, and that's something I need to research more. All in all, it is a joy to see Max talking sense on the playground, bringing in history, logic, and facts so that their only retort is to talk over him. He's entirely consistent, gives first-hand accounts of being both in Israel and also in Gaza when bombs were dropping previously. And I'm reconsidering my critique earlier of him cornering David Irving and pressing him on whether he was a Holocaust denier. I'm thinking now that I may have misinterpreted that. In summary, I think that what's happening now is not predictable, either as the annihilation of Gaza or the start of World War III. I think that the world has changed, as Middle Nation points out and Max confirms, and that we are in a multipolar shift where I think bets are off, and this could turn out in a way that we're not really being able to look back and say, well, of course it's going to be this way. Right now, the US and NATO has so many irons in the fire, and they're starting fires wherever there are irons, and that can't turn out well. So there are more great sources that my readers have referred me to, so I'm going to continue reviewing them and do a few at a time. But right now, today is the day of rage, and when I look at ABC News, I see massive but peaceful protests that are happening in Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Jordan, and even a few stragglers in Sri Lanka. I'd like to interrupt this day of rage to wish my youngest daughter a happy 25th birthday. I had always had her fooled that I named her Cassandra because she was born on Friday the 13th in October, but darn internet, it always makes a liar out of me. But I want to wish happy birthday, Cassandra. And to follow up, here is the previous episode on Gaza, jailbreak or trap. And then this is a playlist on propaganda and censorship. And even though that's mostly on the COVID con, it also looks at things like Lord Ponsonby's 10 rules for wartime propaganda. Thank you for watching.